Wonderful. Now we have a revolutionary panel here who will tell us about the way forward. If we could ask Bryan, whom has been doing a wonderful job moderating, now to lead. Professor Van Norden has issued a manifesto for the future of philosophy, and here it is, a multicultural manifesto. Please tell us.
Thank you. Oh, good. Well, there's so many people to thank for this wonderful conference, but I'll just be brief and thank Jeffrey Sachs, Phoebe Koundouri, and our wonderful host, the Academy of Athens, for this delightful conference. In 17th century Europe, there were three major theories about the origin of philosophy. The first major theory was that philosophy originated in Africa, and Africa gave philosophy as a gift to Europe. The second major theory was that philosophy originated in India, and from India, philosophy was imported to Europe. Now, I'm sure you can guess what the third major theory was. The third major theory was that philosophy started independently in both India and Africa, and both of them gave it to Europe. The view that philosophy only started once in history in Europe and nowhere else was a quirky, idiosyncratic view in the 17th century in Europe. This didn't mean that people thought less of the tradition that goes back to Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. They still revered that tradition. But these beliefs led them to think that philosophy was intrinsically multicultural and not something that was the parochial property of any one civilization. So unsurprisingly, when knowledge of Confucius was brought back to Europe by Jesuits, it was immediately recognized as philosophical and as very valuable. The sayings of Confucius are known in English as the Analects. And the first translation of the Analects into a European language was a translation into Latin done by Jesuits, who of course had extensive familiarity with the Aristotelian tradition as part of their training. And they translated the Analects under the title that would be rendered in English as Confucius, the Chinese philosopher. Other people in Europe were also fascinated with the new Chinese philosophy. Leibniz said that Chinese philosophy actually was better than European philosophy when it came to ethics and the behavior of mortals, as he put it. In addition, Leibniz, of course, independently developed binary arithmetic, which is the basis for computers. But when he learned about the I Ching, the classic of changes, he was stunned because he said the Chinese independently discovered binary arithmetic before we did, because the changes is built on a system of broken and unbroken lines, essentially ones and zeros, like a binary system. By the way, later in history, Carl Gustav Jung, the great psychologist, was also fascinated with the classic of changes, and one of the most philosophically interesting works on the classic of changes is Carl Jung's foreword to the Wilhelm German translation, which I would recommend to you. Of course, the early modern era was a time of great technological change in the West, and Francis Bacon pointed out that three major technological discoveries were changing civilization: gunpowder, printing with movable type, and the compass. What he did not note was that all three of these came from China. Given how popular Chinese philosophy was when it was introduced to the West, we could only assume that it continued to be popular and continued to be a part of the curriculum, but it did not. It is almost impossible to study Chinese philosophy in philosophy departments in the West. It is even harder to study Indian philosophy in actual philosophy departments in the West. What happened? I'm a great fan of the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and in some ways, at least in epistemology, I consider myself a Kantian. But the fact is that while Kant certainly did not invent racism, He bought into pseudoscientific notions of race and propagated them in his lectures. We now know that in Kant's unpublished lectures, Kant told his students that the races could be arranged hierarchically, with whites at the top, and, pardon me, I'm using his language, Hindus right underneath the whites, which Kant said look like philosophers, but are incapable of philosophical thought. Kant also said that the Chinese were at about the same intellectual level as the Hindus because they have not advanced for over 3,000 years and still believe the same things their ancestors believed. Beneath that was the race of people from Africa. Beneath that were the indigenous Americans. Only the whites, Kant said, contained all the virtues in themselves and were capable of true philosophy. Now, Kant was a brilliant philosopher in other respects, and he revolutionized European philosophers, and his students went on to rewrite the philosophy textbooks, and they wrote Africa and Asia out of the philosophy curriculum. And if you'd like some citations to some of the relevant works on this topic, you can take a look at my book. I'm also very indebted to the work of Peter K.J. Park and his book, Africa, Asia, and the History of Philosophy, which details all of this. Now, personally, I love the tradition that goes back to Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. I love it, I teach it, I try as best I can to live in accordance with it. But I also love the tradition that goes back to Confucius and Lao Tzu and the Buddha, and I teach it, and as best I can, I try to live in accordance with it. And I wrote this book, Taking Back Philosophy, encouraging my fellow philosophers and intellectuals to take philosophy back in two senses, to return to the earlier cosmopolitan ideal, which we've talked about so much today, in which philosophy does not belong to just one civilization, and we can respect multiple intellectual traditions. And also to take philosophy back to the ideal of philosophy as a way of life. So philosophy is not just an intellectual game we play, where we manipulate symbols, but as a guide to how one should live and how one should organize society. This is what philosophy meant for Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. This is what philosophy meant for Confucius and Lao Tzu and the Buddha. In terms of whether and what kind of philosophy we can find in Chinese thought, a lot of my work has focused on the idea that we can interpret both Aristotelianism and Confucianism as forms of virtue ethics. And I argue that virtue ethics, although they differ much in their details, they focus on four things. They're all concerned with what is the best way to live, what virtues do you need in order to live the good life, how do you cultivate those virtues in yourself, and what is human nature like, such that it's possible to cultivate those virtues and live that way of life. So what is the best way of life? What is eudaimonia, or beatitudo, or what is the Tao, the way to live and the way to organize society? What virtues do you need to live well? Virtu, or arete, or de. What is nature in the sense of human nature like, such that you can acquire the virtues? Physis, or natura, or xing in Chinese. And how can you cultivate those virtues in yourself? And there's various terms you can use for cultivation in multiple traditions, like xiaoyang or paideia. And I think if you actually look at what you find in the Chinese tradition, you find a robust philosophical tradition that argues for its conclusions, that makes distinctions, that challenges some aspects of common sense, but also refines other aspects, just as we find in the equally great tradition that goes back to Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. So in terms of education, what I think we need in the future is a genuinely multicultural approach to things like philosophy. We need to learn from all the world's great traditions. As one great poet said, "I am a human, and nothing human is alien to me." Or as one of Confucius's disciples put it, "四海之内，皆兄弟." Within the 4 C's, all are siblings. I'm going to close with a little anecdote. There was this university that had a little controversy. And the controversy was this new faculty member wanted to bring in this foreign philosophy that was not a part of the curriculum. And they were literally on the verge of riots because many of them were traditional faculty said, look, this new philosophy is not part of our tradition. You're watering down the curriculum by bringing it in. The school in question was the University of Paris. The time was the 13th century, and the upstart philosopher who was bringing in the new philosophy that's not part of our tradition was Thomas Aquinas, who was introducing newly rediscovered works of Aristotle into the curriculum. And to me, what's most inspiring about Thomas Aquinas is that he's a Christian who's true to his Christianity, but also says, I can learn from pagans like Plato and Aristotle. I can learn from Jews like Maimonides. I can learn from Muslims like Avicenna and Averroes. And that doesn't mean watering down my tradition. It means being open to the variety of ways in which God manifests in the world. And I hope we can all try to live up to that ideal as we deal with the problems we face in the world today. Thank you.
Bravo. Bryan, we want to adopt your manifesto, which is really, really important. A wonderful book about these academic disputes in the 12th and 13th century is a book called Aristotle's Children by Richard Rubinstein. Fantastic book. And when you see Albert Magnus and Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus, and you realize it's just a normal academic fight. It's a department battle. Who are we going to hire? Who's next? Who says you can appoint the next faculty? It's so wonderful to understand that this was everything we lived through, but the stakes really were so high. And it's an absolutely fantastic story. Next, we're going to hear from Cathay Liu, Professor of Philosophy at Yale and NUS. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to Professor Koundouri, Professor Sachs, and the Academy of Athens for hosting and inviting me to come out here and just meet so many interesting people and have great, interesting conversations. And I say this not because it's a part of the ritual of what we do at talks and thanking the host, because as you will see through my talk on education, that this actually embodies so much of what I personally believe in and the choices that I have made throughout my career. So Yale, I used to be at Yale NUS. Actually, I'm at NUS now. In fact, I was employee number 1. I was the first faculty member hired for this new college that Yale University and the National University of Singapore were going to partner and build in Asia. It was a liberal arts college that was meant to do so many of the things that we are talking about here, about multicultural, interdisciplinary education, to equip the people of the future to be better global citizens, more compassionate, more aware, more equipped to understand the news and the complexities of the world around them, right? Because somehow there was a realization that the educational model and the direction it was going in was no longer sufficient. And at the same time in the US, you had the closing of so many liberal arts departments and philosophy. As a person coming out of a philosophy department, that gave me a little pause. Oh, sorry, my notes just disappeared. But what we built at Yale NUS, starting from the early days, we've had so many discussions about this, was a required curriculum for all of the first years to take. I taught in the philosophy and political thought track. It was a year-long course that spanned 3 millennia and 3 intellectual traditions. So actually probably more than that, depends on where you want to place Sufi texts, but we were reading the Bhagavad Gita, we were reading Xunzi, we were reading Zhuangzi and Kongzi, and yes, Aristotle, and Plato, and Epictetus, and also He Yingzhen, and Neo-Confucians. Like, I could go on, the list is endless, and it was glorious. And the students went in not knowing any better about where disciplinary boundaries were, and they came out naturally putting all of these ideas and all of these cultures in dialogue. I've also now been called on. I had moved out of Yale NUS over to NUS because they have started a new college at NUS. It is the merging of the the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences with the Faculty of Sciences. It's now the College of Humanities and Sciences. There's a lot of abbreviations there. But again, with a similar idea that it had to be now an interdisciplinary education for the students, because I don't know about many other countries, but surely in Singapore and other schools in Asia, people get specialized and streamlined very quickly. And the problems of the world, maybe I'm tempted to say today, but I think as they ever were, are always very complex. And so I want to appeal to 2 texts that we teach there in both these programs. What I love, by the way, about the new course that I've developed at NUS is instead of just philosophy and political thought, we now also get to bring in literature and history as well. So it really breaks through a lot of disciplinary boundaries. But today what I want to do is take 2 texts that we teach in those curricula and talk about what they say about education. So kind of have it apply to itself, and time permitting, maybe a couple reflections about how that gets implemented and what I've observed and learned during the last 9 years, having the privilege of building 2 curricula that I find so important. Okay, so the first is coming out of Descartes. That's actually where I specialize. And there's this text that I love that is probably not read enough of Descartes, called The Rules for the Direction of the Native Intelligence. And it's a book that is meant to teach you how to learn. I mean, what could be better? He starts off by saying, look, people have a tendency to think that you have to specialize. During the time that he was writing, he had a state-of-the-art education through La Fletch, Yale, Jesuit education. They kind of systematized and spread it across Europe. It was revolutionary. But what he discovered was that there were very narrow disciplinary boundaries, and he thought that this was getting in the way of inquiry. And his point there was that we had to teach people to just be smart. Or he thought everyone had enough reason, but that it was the direction of reason of the mind that was most important. So he says there, I think of that because we had this wonderful talk about Prometheus, and I remember Wednesday, the phrase, under the shadow of Prometheus, that has stuck with me, right? He had said that the light does not change regardless of the objects upon which it shines. So it does not matter if you are learning physics or biology or ethics or political science or economics. The craft, and this is what I find so fascinating there, is he constantly uses craft metaphors, that learning is a craft that we must cultivate. And this whole text is about cultivating the craft of your mind and using your attention to discover things. And the first of which was to think about reason in general. And this, I'm happy, is a trend in education, right? We now talk about skills, about critical thinking in a way that we probably weren't just 20 years ago. But with this, then he says, look, he also does talk about reading good books, which I love. His reflections about his education as an educator I have mixed feelings about. He praises it and slams it all at the same time. But the good things that he says like, of reading good books, it's like having a conversation with the most distinguished men of past ages. Indeed, a rehearsed conversation in which these authors reveal to us only the best of their thoughts, right? This is often something I appeal to when I talk to students. They're like, why are we reading old dead guys? It takes some work sometimes to convince them of the utility, but also, I love this metaphor of like conversing with those of past centuries, right? He says is very much like traveling, and it reminds me of Proust, where he says the voyage of discovery begins not with visiting new vistas, but with seeing with new eyes. And that's what education can do. This is what Descartes is trying to do. And he said the benefit of this is that we come to know how susceptible to customs we are of our own, and that encountering the other is a way of drawing attention to this in ourselves. So there's this aspect of Descartes, and I leave you with one last Descartes metaphor before I move on. In Rule 8, one of my favorite metaphors that he gives is comparing the craft of education to that of blacksmithing. And it's so beautiful because he says, like blacksmithing, this craft that he's engaged in for universal wisdom, right, universal science, is the craft in which the production of the tools is dictated by the craft itself, and it's so cool. If you ever get a chance, please read Rule 8. But let me then take this line of thought, of this interdisciplinary, also multicultural thought, and bring Xunzi into the conversation. Because like Descartes, his metaphors were also very craft-oriented. This is in contrast to maybe thinkers like Mengzi, who used agricultural metaphors, where if you plant a seed, you water it, weed it, take care of it, it'll turn out all right, right? And what I love about Xunzi, those students tend to think that he's very negative about humanity. I actually think is one of the most beautiful views of humanity that I've ever read, right? He views the human as the only creature that can engage in self-improvement and self-edification and cultivation. And this is the crafting of our own humanity that humans are capable of doing. And so the first chapter of the Xunzi is an exhortation to learning, which, again, I highly recommend. But he also says it begins with reciting the classics and studying ritual. But my favorite section of Xunzi says, learning proceeds until death, and only then does it stop. And so the order of learning has a stopping point, but its purpose cannot be given up for even a moment. To pursue it is to be human, to give it up is to be a beast, right? Along the lines of many of the speakers that have come before me in the last couple days, there is this discussion about like the content that we learn, and we see that it's insufficient, right? That there has to be action. We talked about like, how do we get the desires to change, to do the things that we need to see done, to have a different orientation. And I think this is where I would want to take these ideas in Xunzi and the ideas in Descartes and merge them together, right? Because it's not just a craft, it's not just about the outcome or the product, but there's this lifelong, ever continuous accumulation of working on an attitude towards how we learn as the default orientation that we take into the world. So with this in mind, I have some thoughts about this, because the big question is like, how do we do it? How do we change our desires, or how do we build a sense of like a compassion or empathy or cohesiveness and all the wish lists of important things that we really need to happen? How do we do it? And I do not know, and I don't know that anyone answer is sufficient. But Xunzi does talk a lot about the importance of teachers, but mainly because they serve as good models. And so it's this that I want to kind of end with my own personal reflections of doing this in the classroom with the students. I know when they walk out, they're going to walk out with a ton of misreadings of everything that has happened in class, to the extent that I kind of wish they don't tell people they were in my class, lest they think that I've taught them incorrectly. However, I've come over the years to realize that what is most important about what I do in the educational context is to model the mindset of curiosity, of like intentional listening, of the dialogue. Because if we take Descartes seriously, that reading these books is like visiting other places and we get to know other figures and other cultures, and there has to be a back and forth dialogue, but these texts do not speak back in the way that that people usually do. So you have to model like how to have a conversation with something like a text or a culture, right? Something so abstract. So I have a couple suggestions, and I feel like we've actually been modeling this a lot now, but in terms of this as a view of education, I mean, ideally we expand this so that like in every home from the beginning, we're just humans that model this intellectual curiosity and conversation with each other. But every year, I just wanted to observe, one thing I noticed, that every year I'm teaching these texts, I am hearing and seeing and learning new things, right? That it's, in that sense, it is like a dialogue. And when I read one text for a long time and I suddenly add another one into the mix, new ideas start popping up. And so again, it's as simple as noting this to the students. I feel like they pick up on your sense of wonder. And when they see that, they are attracted to that. And that's when you can start modeling, well, this is how it works. I did not know that. I've read it 100 times. I'm an expert in my field, but lo and behold, the learning does not end. Isn't that so great? They definitely pick up on that. Also, suggestion, just like traveling to new places, try not to compare things with the things back home too much, right? Because you will get in your own way. Again, Proust, seeing with new eyes becomes imperative. I think there's other ways that we can kind of demonstrate this. I've already been hearing in the conference. A lot of times the translations into familiar words are necessary. They are necessary, but they are eventually a ladder that we want to kick away and maybe use the actual terms like eudaimonia or de or tien, right? Because the subtleties are important. But again, the accessibility initially is also important, and balancing those two things. Finally, in terms of along this vein, on the comparative line, my instinct has always been to pull them away from comparison. They want to do it right away. I understand the impulse, but usually I would prefer that they read the text on its own terms, charitably, more like as its own personality, before they start comparing it to other things that they're more familiar with. And in this sense, I feel like, to tie this with other parts of the discussion of rituals, or like how the Confucian like values kind of get built through the things that we do, I think this translates into building a better ability to be empathetic and compassionate towards others, right? You just refrain from judgment, because comparison requires a judgment. Refrain from that as long as possible to understand what it is on its own terms. And then when the comparison comes in, just like any conversation you want to have, you want the other person to be like, I wonder why you said it that way, or what direction you're coming from, that this is the form the question takes, as opposed to how it appears in another discipline or another culture. And finally, to conclude, I'm sorry, I don't know where I am on time, I just want to reiterate this idea that I love so much from the Xunzi, that this really is a lifelong cultivation, a craft of, like, we're crafting ourselves and how we navigate everything else around us, other people, other ideas, and to constantly be demonstrating and working and nurturing the curiosity, the dialogue, and the openness. And that's just where I'm going to end it today. Thank you so much.
Wow, bravo, fantastic. We have to brainstorm a little bit about how to take this worldwide, because it's very, very important and powerful. We need your reading lists, by the way, and we need to read them, but also there are many things that we can do that are creative or different. Live courses that reach worldwide. now is rather routine if we want to do it. Of course, a MOOC where you say that and it reaches millions of people, which it should. But one of the things we need from you is not only the thrilling enthusiasm and motivation, but actually what to do and the substance and what to read and what the curriculum is, because in most places, for reasons that Bryan described, there are not people that know. And so what to do and how to address that and how to use digital means to do a wider reach. I just want us to think about that, because I don't think there's resource limitations and so forth. There's just the question of what is the best way that we should move forward. So, Father James.
And maybe, Jeff, one difficulty that I find, maybe I'm limited, but how do we move to interdisciplinarity when specialization is so central? There are many ways to do it, but what is the most efficient way to do this?
We will discuss.
No,
yes, of course, I agree. Father James Dominic Rooney, Professor of Philosophy at Hong Kong Baptist University. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today. My brothers told me when I said, oh, it's 7 to 10 minutes, I said, oh, that's a good Sunday homily time. So my Sunday homily for you today on a Friday is going to be a little different, perhaps, about the nature of education, liberal arts and the failure of liberalism. And like a good homily, I'll end with 3 points. John Rawls once claimed, the hope of political community must indeed be abandoned, if by such a community we mean a political society united in affirming a general and comprehensive doctrine. In his mind, the pursuit of the good with a capital G had to be subordinated to pursuit of the right in society, or the just, because people fight over the good. The view that we can agree on these basic principles of justice, although we remain neutral on the higher questions of the good, remained influential for some time, but has already started to run into some serious issues in our own time. Some of us may know Alistair MacIntyre, who's now at Notre Dame, his criticism of the modern liberal state. He criticizes, he says, modern nation states are governed through a series of compromises between a range of more or less conflicting economic and social interests. And the outcome is that although most citizens share in such public goods as those of a minimally secure order, the distribution of goods by government, it in no way reflects a common mind, arrived at through widespread shared deliberation governed by norms of rational inquiry. What MacIntyre became famous for was criticizing the fact of modern liberal democracies as fragmenting our rationality. We have no shared moral vocabulary. Our notion of the virtues is scattered. In this room, we probably know as Aristotelians, as Confucians, as Taoists, that hard to explain to our students what these concepts are and how they apply to their lives, because most people start to impose their own syncretic understanding of morality. But since MacIntyre wrote those words, liberal ideals and institutions have come under more serious attack, I think. An American academic wrote this famous book now, Why Liberalism Has Failed. He argued liberalism has failed not because it fell short, but because it was true to itself. As it's become more fully itself, its inner logic has become more evident, and self-contradictions manifest. It's generated pathologies, a political philosophy that was launched to foster greater equality and defend a pluralist tapestry of different cultures and beliefs, protect human dignity, and of course expand liberty, in practice is now generating titanic inequality, enforces uniformity and homogeneity, fosters material and spiritual degradation, and undermines freedom. My point is to agree slightly with this critique. I will agree with it somewhat ironically. Start with where I agree. McIntyre and Patrick Deneen are right that modern society we live in fosters and inculcates what an old Catholic bishop in the United States once called nothingism, taught by the public school system. Liberalism focuses on social and economic interests, often by avoiding questions of the good and leading to fragmentation for lack of a shared moral vision among citizens. And as we know today, that's resulted in some disastrous consequences. Liberalism is unable to defend the moral value of a free society against the assaults of people around the world against human rights and against a shared common life. Our educational practice mirrors this situation now, I think, consisting in a plurality of scientific facts or technical skills without anything to hold them together. Our contemporary practice in education, which for all its talk of interdisciplinarity, nevertheless finds itself in an increasingly technocratic, administratocratic, and utilitarian mode. Fragmentation is the inevitable result as we add more and more layers to administration in your university, as I share in mine. John Henry Newman, writing around 100 years ago from today, wrote this: "What has been the practical error of the last 20 years has been not to load the memory of the student with a mass of undigested knowledge so much as to force upon him so much that he's rejected it all. It's been the error of distracting and enfeebling the mind, implying that a smattering in a dozen branches of study is not shallowness, which it really is, but enlargement, which it is not. Whether it be the schoolboy or girl or the politician in the Senate, all have been the victims in one way or another of this most preposterous and pernicious of delusions. Wise men have lifted up their voices in vain, and at length, lest their own institutions should disappear in the folly of the hour, as we know in the United States with the disappearance of philosophy departments, but they've been obliged to humor a spirit which they could not understand and make temporizing concessions at which they could not but inwardly smile until disaster struck." Where I disagree with McIntyre and Deneen is that freedom is to blame. What we find is that many of our global challenges in governance are directly tied to a lack of moral force in justifying our ideals and institutions as integral and meaningful to living a good life as human beings. That breakdown was clear, I think, in many pundits' reactions in the West to the invasion of Ukraine, including Deneen and some of his compatriots, who went to defend Russia's claims that the spiritual legacy of the West was under attack by gays in the West, in Ukraine, and that this was defending the Russian world against the onslaught of Nazis in Ukraine. Some Western pundits even accused the West of fanning the flames and hypocrisy in their language of human rights and freedom. So too, the depiction of the conflict of the West as jealously guarding against the rise of civilizational powers has been a smokescreen, I think, sometimes for some of these other same concerns, what I might call the ideology of domination. Human rights, rule-based order, or democracy became equivocations in different mouths. Liberalism is weak stuff and has made our citizens incapable of having the robust and critical moral grammar to resist ideologies of domination. What we want to discover is who is right, and it's clear to me that someone is. Either a life in an open society is good for people or it isn't. Either people who are innocent have a right to defend themselves. Either aggression is wrong or it isn't. We can debate what the basis of human rights is, but we can't just go back and forth with jingoism. What we need is a moral defense. What I suggest today is education is one way in which we can remedy those defects without embracing a return to ideologies of domination. I don't think it's sufficient to resolve our problems in governance, but it's clearly a necessary one to be able to offer a justification for the free society, to be able to engage in moral deliberation together. What I want to suggest is the liberal education model, classical humanistic education, inherited from classical Greece through their scholastic successors in the quadrivium and trivium, and the Chinese tradition, equally, focused on the educational project of the classics. 3 points. The classical education had knowledge as an end in itself, and it was liberating. As Jushi famously said in his preface to The Great Learning, governance of men led through the fathoming of principle and the rectifying of the mind. The higher learning liberates us and is a counterpoint to the technocratic utilitarian model we often find in our own universities. Newman said it draws the mind off from things which will harm it to subjects which are worthy of a rational being. Classical or liberal arts education flourishes against skepticism, undermining our nihilism in the ability of our traditions to find truth and something meaningful to guide the good in our societies. Second, liberal education ennobles. It makes us recognize our worth as thinkers is not tied to sex or nationality. There's no Chinese or Vietnamese mathematics, but only truth, and the prince and pauper are equal in its light. It opens up the mind of individuals beyond the limits of our own time and place and founds the free society in that discourse. Lastly, liberal arts unite us in the truth. A free world and open society is united by its mode of deliberation, a commitment to convince others through logos, to pursue the truth together, rather than to impose our will through violence. That moral principle that government is for the good of its people and occurs through free and equal deliberation is what keeps us together. In the end, Newman has also a good reminder for us. By great authors, the many are drawn up into unity. National character is fixed. A people speaks. The past and the future, the East and the West, are brought into communion with each other. In proportion as we master great literature in whatever language and imbibe its spirit, we shall ourselves become in our own measure the minister of like benefits to others, who are united to us by our personal ties and are within the sphere of our influence. Under places where the ideologies of domination reign, to tell the truth, to speak your mind, is often to sign your own arrest warrant. A regime that lives on lies and fear tries to disable the education of its citizens, insisting that rights to livelihood, food, money, and entertainment take precedence over knowledge and justice. This past week, I had a seminar with our Dominican brothers from Myanmar who are living under the military junta. The military closed precisely educational institutions, any that would oppose the regime. I was talking to the student brothers about natural law, the right to resist unjust regimes, the limits of possible resistance, moral conscience formation in hard times. The life of the mind is not for elite people. This is the last message I'd like to leave you. These three notions that liberal arts ennobles, educates, frees us. It's for the poor. It's for the poor who live under the situations of oppression to be taught the liberal arts, to have that preserved in their life, because it moves them beyond the hostile environment they are to understanding that truth and justice are more important. What we can do is to help people to see the lies for what they are, that they shouldn't sell their birthright for a mess of pottage, and that they too were made for truth and not to be slaves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wonderful homily indeed, very powerful, and very, I think, a very important and interesting insight. Rawls thought we could somehow reach a consensus on justice without having to address the good at all. And I think what you're saying is that that's a very odd idea to begin with. Justice is also tough to reach a consensus, but one can also search for consensus of the good. What is the good? Which is an extremely important activity for society. And if I understand you, also, if I've interpreted properly, you're saying that the search for the good is not in violation with freedom. Freedom can allow for a common search for the good. Freedom doesn't excuse the common search for the good. It doesn't say, well, we're free, so we do what we want. It says we are free to search together for what is the common good. And I think it's an extremely important vantage point. I also think, from maybe a little naive, but from my experience, that even regimes like in Myanmar can come to understand that the universities are not the threat, and not to have a pitched battle between the universities and the regime, but actually are part of how the society can function better. And so I always try to find a path that is not a direct confrontation. I don't like the labels of governments, particularly even governments we may think are horrendous, have their own virtues or possibilities of virtues also. So I don't like to categorize them one way or another, because that puts different governments into corners and creates self-fulfilling animosities and tensions. I don't want to oversimplify, but I always think that there is a potential for finding more common ground, and we need governments to understand universities are at the core of societies. They're not threats to power so much as the capacity of a society to function and to develop its ideas. And I do think that that's possible to find that language, or at least I hope so. Our fourth wonderful panelist is Sofia-Eleftheria, Gonida Professor of Educational Psychology and Human Development at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki.
To be here with you today, and I would like to express my sincere thanks to Professor Jeffrey Sachs for his honoring invitation, as well as to my dear colleague Nikos Theodosiou. But my special thanks are due to Professor Phoebe Koundouri and her excellent group, as well as to the Academy of Athens for organizing such a stimulating, wonderful meeting. So my talk today will be on educational communities in uncertain times as an educational and developmental psychology, as Professor Sachs has just said. So I will focus on school and educational communities during our times. And I will specifically focus on the need for sustainable learning and youth resilience. So we have heard several times during all these 2.5 days that we live in uncertain times. Seemingly apparent certainties are challenged by several phenomena such as technological advancements, migration and population mobility, climate change, we heard so much about that, socioeconomic downturns, political instability, and nowadays we also experience our democratic values to be under dispute. In addition to all this, COVID-19 has created unprecedented challenges and changes and further increased our experienced uncertainty on a worldwide scale. We have all experienced the abrupt disruption of education. The learning process necessarily had to change from face-to-face to online. All members of school communities, students, teachers, parents included, have faced and still face several challenges in coping with these changes and in adapting to these new societal, economic, and educational settings. However, we all know that education per se as a phenomenon, as a process, or as a set of processes is constantly changing at the same time, modifying or redefine learning and teaching environments from very early age through the lifespan. So we as researchers, and particularly all those of us who work in relevant fields, are challenged to decode this increased complexity of educational processes at times of global change and uncertainty, and to introduce evidence-based practices and reforms to educational policymakers. We heard several times about the need policymakers to base their decisions on scientific data, decisions to be data-driven and scientifically based. So it's the same here, because we think that only evidence-based knowledge can bring some certainty, let's say, to the current uncertainty. So moreover, we know that there is a very large number of students in all educational levels and worldwide that face increased difficulties and obstacles. So we call them students at risk because they are indeed at risk for falling behind successful adaptation at school or college and for not completing education, and not only higher education, but also compulsory education. So we even, we heard Jeff talking before about thousands of students who don't attend schools, or our previous speaker talking about poor children who cannot access education. So by students at risk, we mean, of course, several groups, such as students with special educational needs, students having a migrant or refugee background, students with coming from the sexual orientation and gender identity minority, but also students who face severe mental health issues. And we all know that students with mental health difficulties have dramatically increased during the last decade, particularly after the pandemic, and we're gonna face them in the coming years. But also, as I said earlier, there is a large pool of students disadvantaged socioeconomic, coming from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds, who indeed are in great need to have access to education and to complete education. So all these groups are more likely to lack basic skills, such as literacy, numeracy, and digital competencies, as well as skills for self-directed learning, and are at higher risk for disengagement in education, poor academic outcomes, dropout, as I said, declined self-perceptions, future limited access to educational and work opportunities, life adversities, and ultimately to social exclusion. Moreover, we know that at times of global change and uncertainty, the risks are even increased. Recently, we experienced the problem of digital poverty, the problem of social distancing due to the pandemic, but also students having a migrant or refugee background are more likely to experience stress and trauma, and they bring all these difficulties during education and perhaps during their whole life. So, actions to be taken. So I will address 2 questions, and I will come to potential answers to these questions later on. So the first question is how to empower then all students, including the most vulnerable ones, like I just mentioned, students at risk, towards successful adaptation, study completion, and resilience to cope with adversities. In other words, how we can make our education more accessible. Because if we make our education more accessible, then we increase the likelihood for a more inclusive society. At the same time, in order to be able to empower our students, we need to find ways to support teachers and educators and other school personnel, and to support them to be well equipped for the future and to be able to effectively support all students. And actually, we need to make them aware of the role of societal change in their profession and their lives, but also to let them be aware of their role in the societal change and in the change of the lives of their students. So the role of school and educational communities could be just drawing from our ancient wisdom to cultivate students' virtues, or if we wish to use our psychological vocabulary, to meet students' multiple needs and go beyond their academic needs, to embrace their social needs, their emotional needs, their personal needs. So we need students to be able to interact with others effectively, to regulate their emotions, but at the same time to be passionate for what they are doing, but also to have, let's say, the sense of autonomy or be self-confident for what they are doing. In a sense, and in other words, actually, we need to adopt more holistic, more systemic approaches, as my dearest colleague Sonia from the Aristotle University mentioned earlier. And actually, I was very excited, Sonia, to see how our talks, how close our talks are. You are an engineer, I'm a psychologist, but it's fantastic how fields communicate to each other. So we need to adopt more holistic, systemic approaches and to contribute to the development of students' academic, motivational, and socio-emotional needs, or in other words, to educate the whole child. And not only the whole child to adopt this systemic approach, but this approach should be also dynamic, because the whole child develops across the years, but the whole child develops within a context or different contexts, which also change as time passes. But in order to have all these, let's say, desirable outcomes, we can't have them all these desirable outcomes, unless educators are very well prepared to foster students' virtues and critical competencies, to support students' need satisfaction and create optimal learning environments. So I will conclude with few recommendations, evidence-based recommendations, because as I said, we need to take actions based on evidence. So all these recommendations come from different psychological and not only theories that have been supported by evidence. So first of all, we should build powerful, peaceful, and constructive learning environments for all students. Students have the right to feel safe at their schools and have the right to have the sense of belonging, that they are an integral part in their schools, and not to feel excluded out of their learning environment. We have to focus on building communication and collaboration skills. We heard also so many things about the importance of communication, of effective communication and collaboration. Last night, Professor Sachs said that even for rivals, they need to sit down before a war and discuss and collaborate and communicate effectively. So students should learn to collaborate effectively with their peers, teachers with their colleagues, parents also, other school administrators, but also teachers with their students, teachers with their parents, or parents with their teachers effectively, because these are all very important and critical issues nowadays and come up in the literature very often. We also need to support the cultivation of the so-called competencies for the 21st century. So we need to support, let's say, our future citizens to respond, to be well prepared to respond to unexpected challenges, to actively participate and contribute to our society, to social progress, to peace, to sustainability, or as we could say, to common good, whatever we mean with that. We need also good thinkers. And in order our youth, our students, to be good thinkers, They need to be self-regulated, but also co-regulated and critical thinkers. They need to plan, to be able to plan, to monitor their behavior, to evaluate their behavior and also others' behavior, and to be skeptical in front of what they are listening from the others. Nowadays, all students, and actually all of us, are exposed to tons of information, and much of them are misinformation and fake information. So our youth needs to be well equipped with those skills. Minister Kerameos also mentioned, talked about that. So we need to educate them to cultivate their skills to evaluate information and to select the valid and reliable information, and to be skeptical in front of what they are listening from the others. Active engagement. We have to encourage students to be actively engaged behaviorally, emotionally, and cognitively. We know from prior evidence that engaged students compared to their disengaged peers are 2.5 times more likely to have better learning outcomes and complete higher education, but also they are 4.5 times more, to be more hopeful for the future and to flourish in their lives, which is extremely important. Drawing from self-determination theory, which is a very popular and very important psychological motivational theory, our learning environments should be developed to satisfy the three basic psychological needs: autonomy support, competence support, and relatedness or connectedness, as we heard several times in previous talks. So students have to feel autonomous, that they can take decisions, but at the same time to build their competencies and to feel self-competent and self-confident, as we will see in the next block, and also to feel part of a network, of a connecting network, that they can have support when they need it, but also to be able to provide support to others of the same network. Also, we need to support our students' self-worth, self-confidence, and a positive mindset for self, because we are going to have good learning outcomes and optimal results only if we have self-confident students. If we have students who do not believe to themselves, who lack basic skills, then I'm afraid we can't expect much. Or students who are more academically, let's say, oriented, and we miss, let's say, the whole child approach. Equity, diversity, and inclusion. This is another very important issue. We have to raise awareness for diverse, minority, and disadvantaged groups, but also to raise awareness is not enough. We have to support educators to build, to acquire the knowledge and skills to support EDI groups. And in order to have all these things, we have to have very good educators. This is something that came up from different talks. We need to have well-educated and properly trained in our changing world educators, but also we need to have caring educators, caring for their students, caring for the society, caring for our youth, caring for our future. Teachers that will have, let's say, a broad and professional identity, which will go beyond their academic role and implement what we have just said. So, from what I have just described, I think it is important to see the point that we need students not only to be competent to learn, but also to like learning and to wish to learn. Yesterday, Professor Sachs differentiated wanting from liking. So we really want our students to like to be at school, to like what they learn. And this also comes from Aristotle, because Aristotle has said that thought by itself moves nothing. Without feelings of desire, the human capacity for rational thought would lack any power to act. And by all this, we will be able to develop and to build resilient, caring, and inclusive school and educational communities. And we will be able to work for sustainable learning, for skills development. We said about that we should not care only for the outcomes or the products of learning, but of the processes, how to acquire learning, how to develop our skills, because this is going to be for long. Sorry. And these resilient, caring, and inclusive educational communities will be our shield, our response in potential future times of unexpected crisis. And together with sustainable learning, they will contribute to active, virtuous, just drawing from our ancient wisdom again, and healthy citizenship. We also heard about that. Sustainable development and democratic societies. Or simply saying, we want our education, or pedia, as Professor Sfendoni has mentioned several times, to be a source of positive change in our society. And actually, education is our hope in uncertain times. And this is, I will finish with that, this is the logo of a large conference we organize next year in August 2023 in Thessaloniki. It is the 20th Biennial Early Conference. It's the European Association for the Research on Learning and Instruction. So we have the honor to host this conference next August, and our logo is education as a hope in uncertain times, and you are all very welcome. So thank you very much.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much. Not only cutting-edge research, but I would say very and utterly Aristotelian through and through. Aristotle would absolutely, if we could zoom in right now, which he would absolutely applaud that approach, and it's exactly in the spirit of the Nicomachean Ethics. So, yeah, really wonderful. Start on the list with Robin Wang, a professor of philosophy, director of Asia Pacific Studies of Loyola Marymount University. Thank you. Robin, thank you so much. And please, why don't you speak at the...
All right. I thought this is the last panel, and so this is
Homework.
I'm very honored to be here, and this magnificent place, and beautiful people, and amazing discussions. So I'm very moved with this last few days. And I also taking this workshop as invitation to explore the link between ancient wisdom and the modern challenges. Can we find the link? How should we go about it? So for me, I will think the problem today in the world, contemporary time, if I can use one word to describe, that will be aggression. So we see aggression at every levels, person to person, nation to nation, and humans to environment. So to address this problem, I like to start with three legendary heroes. That's the Chinese culture, traditional, and cultural heroes. We see these three heroes in different, wide range of text. In Mencius, in Zhuangzi, and then historical materials. We see this, and this, now I have this kind of like quotations from Gordian, from excavated material. Talk about, so now let's look at what are these three heroes about. These three heroes set model for political leaders, military generals, and the virtuous person to follow. So this is also come from the chapter called Respect Virtue. If we have some sort of virtue, what exactly that virtue be like? So let's go, there is 3 heroes. The first hero called Da Yu, managing water. So Da Yu is the one learned from his father's mistakes, how to control, not even control, deal with flood. So he found a way to follow the nature of water, and now the building the dams and to stop flood. Because his father tried 9 years, did not work. So he learned it, and going with the flow of water, he successfully gets things done. Secondly is Zhao Fu, riding horses. So this is riding horses is one of 6 Confucian Chinese classic education. So riding horses is a complicated task because you want to look at the weather, terrain, and the temperament of horses, and also riders' psychological, mental, emotional state. So now how should you ride? The riders should integrate the different elements into a coherent whole. And so Zhao Fu able to do so. The third hero is Hou Qi, and cultivate land to take good care of earth. Hou Qi is the father of Chinese farming, and also we talk about he is the one introduced the millet to humanity. Okay. So if we quickly look at these 3 heroes and ask human beings to follow, then question is there a common patterns we found within these 3 stories? Is there is a thread can tie these 3 things, 3 stories together? So I will think, now I pick up one term to describe. This is in Chinese called the zhou. It's very hard to translate. I can see maybe most close translation and also makes sense in English will be suppleness. So let's look at what exactly means this suppleness means. Let's look at the character itself. The character itself consists of 2 parts. One is the spear. Spear, on the right side, you can see Chinese ancient weapons. Spear on the first pointing part, the head is metal. It's tough, strong. But this hard and the strong has to support it by soft wood. So you see the wood is a body and the spear is hard. Another part is we see is wood. So rou, the bottom part is wood. If you put the 3 wood together, then become a forest. So clearly, this idea of zhou derived from human experience with trees. Tree plays important roles in our life. Now, the tree, also I will look at the dictionary, the first dictionary, Chinese dictionary called the 说文解字, and the saying explains what zhou means. It means it's a tree which has 2 modes, bending and straight. Now, bending means you can think about tree is rooted, have a root, rooted in the earth, yet bend in the wings. And it's like a bamboo. You bend with the wind, but never break. So zhou is a part of this characters. And then another thing we can see in 说文解字, also think Confucius is zhou. In here, take a role as moral characters. The kings should have a role to take care its kindness and compassion towards people. And this is, analysts talk about a friend is good at a role because good at care. Now, then there is a third meanings of role is from Dao De Jing. So this is a Dao De Jing chapter 76. Quickly, I'm not reading this, quickly saying, Dao De Jing talk about if we look at the trees, plants, human beings, as long as there is life, there is suppleness, there is role. The dead tree, dead plant, and the dead human beings, the things you know it, one, it's become stiff, brittle. And then secondly, it's easy to break. You think about if you break dead tree, it's easier than break out the a live tree. And when human beings, life left the body, first the symptoms will be stiff. Okay, so this, from this experiment, and Dao De Jing derives that therefore, suppleness is a companion of life, and the hardness is companion of death. Now, this is one example. Another example I like to talk about is also from Taoism, is the idea of a human body. So suppleness is illustrated, first of course, we can see snap of a bow, right? When bows, you have to bend it in order to fly far. If there is no bending, then there is no, you cannot go, there is no distance. Now, important for Taoist, the idea is to experience this role from our body. Our body have a different mode, and then if here from aging people, you know, first thing you know you are getting old is your body being stiffness. So Dao De Jing also talk about we should return to infant because the infant is flexible. Right, so this is really open up a different stories and also the way we think about human perception and also to rethink about narratives of our action. So this is one I will say is examples I can see to support or to understand, to illustrate this idea of role. Now, what do we do if we know we have the problems, global problem of aggression, and then what the philosophy can do? Right, so there's many ways we can approach these problems. Of course, Yin Yang, I wrote this book, Yin Yang, but I'm not going to talk about, but I will talk about the spirit of it. So in other words, how can we really apply this ancient wisdom, suppleness in our contemporary time? I come up with three things. So one is yielding. What is this suppleness about? Suppleness is about create the space between you and the surroundings. It's yielding. Right? So this space is very important because that is how give us a chance to reflection and to take action. So this is this idea of Wu Wei or Ziran. They all think non-action, but the way I do think is actually is thinking about the space. We need space. Secondly is repositioning. Now conflict, tension, fight is inevitable, but the solution should be multiple. It's not only violence and the control is a way to dealing with conflict. So how should we do it? Then we thinking about actually first, we will be repositioned to explore what is the cause of this conflict. And then I think maybe a better way to think about is martial arts. If we think about there is a Kung Fu fight, calligraphy, if you think about Chinese art, painting, they always have this kind of idea. If you push, you thread a punch, you avoid, but then you attack, called blending energy. This blending energy is used how to, just like riding horses, right? Pull, push, and pull. So in this here, in Zhao riding horses is you get it from your heart, but you respond from your hand. This is a push and a pull. And so to really have this sense of pay attention to surroundings, to understand our opinions, to understand others, is a sense of engagement, connections. So I think this is the important things to think about what the role actually entails. Okay. The third is resonating. Now, resonating here, I mentioned is to pay attention to invisibles, inaudible, and also intangible forces. So this is we used to see in a Tao Te Ching, we confront in daytime, but we know night will coming, right? So we know there is many things when we engage, we see this world, there is many unseen elements. So we should enact it and also to understand, to connect, bring into light, bring into the presence, because this is presence and the non-presence are coexist. So should have this kind of more complicated way to thinking about the situations or the conflict, the problems. So this, then another thing I would want to see, this is actually my last slide, I want to make sure in 10 minutes. Okay, so now we think about the philosophy. We see the Greek philosophy starting wonder with the O. Okay. So we contemplate, the focus is question, what is truth? What is goodness? What is beauty? That's our pursuit. But then there is another kind of philosophical tradition that I use one, I say the wonder, so with the A. What is wonder is about? Well, literally you can see it's walking around in the wood and to connecting with the land, to at a sense of presence, right? So, but also the wonder with A, it's about uncertainty. It's about the unfolding, it actually sense could be think about this unfolding the world. So it's like just how to direct energy, and it's not controlling energy, just like a 大禹 manage the water, and to going with it, with the flow. So this sense of wonder, the focus is where is the way? How can we solve these problems? And the power lying competence, not in control. Thank you.